It was early October of 2014 when I decided to take a short camping trip through the rural parts of Missouri. I was 32 at the time, living alone in a small apartment just outside of Jefferson City. I didn't have much going on that month, and the cooler air was starting to settle in, which always made me feel more alive. I worked construction during the week, but I took a few days off to recharge. I had this habit of just heading out with my gear and no set destination. Just a full tank, a packed cooler, and an old tent I'd used since my 20s. I drove west, following some old county roads I hadn't been on in years. They stretched out across farmland and deep patches of forest that hadn't changed much since I was a kid. It was the kind of place where you'd pass one house every 10 miles and see more rusted-out tractors than people. My only rule when I camped like this was to stay off other people's land if it looked maintained. But if it was clear that the land was abandoned or forgotten, I usually figured no one would care if I pitched a tent overnight. By the time the sun was dropping low, I saw a turnoff with no road sign, just a gravel path disappearing between tall trees. I pulled off and followed it for maybe half a mile until it opened up into a clearing. In the middle of it stood an old barn, gray, sagging, clearly unused for decades. Weeds had swallowed the foundation, and the doors were hanging off their hinges. Beyond it was a wide field leading to a thick tree line. No tire tracks, no recent footprints, no livestock, just the wind, dry grass, and the sound of my engine cooling down. I parked my truck near the edge of the clearing and walked around to check for signs that someone might come through. The barn had a locked side door, but the padlock was rusted so badly I doubted it had moved in 20 years. There were broken boards scattered around and a pile of old feed bags inside, but nothing recent. No signs of squatters or hunters. Felt forgotten. I figured I'd found the perfect spot. I set up my tent near the back of the clearing where the grass was lower and the view of the sky was open. There was no cell service, of course, but that didn't bother me. I didn't come out here to be online. I made a small fire with some branches I gathered near the tree line and ate a sandwich while the night took over. The stars came out fast. It got colder quicker than I expected. I zipped up my jacket and sat by the fire, just staring into the flames. No animals made noise, no crickets, no owls. It was quiet in a way that should have been peaceful but wasn't. I brushed the feeling off. I'd been alone in the woods plenty of times. Sometimes your mind just gets weird in the dark. I got into my tent around 10. My flashlight flickered a bit, but it was working fine. I read from a paperback for a little while, then turned the light off and lay down. I woke up once around midnight to pee. The fire was just glowing embers. The air was freezing. My breath came out in thick clouds. The moon was full and bright, enough that I could see all the way across the field. I didn't notice anything strange at the time, just an uneasy feeling, like someone was watching from the trees. I told myself it was nothing, zipped the tent back up, and forced myself to sleep. When I woke up again, it was still dark, maybe 3:30 or 4 a.m. I wasn't sure what woke me up. I lay still for a few minutes, just listening. Then I heard it, dry grass crunching. Not constantly, just once every few seconds. Soft, measured, like someone trying to move without being heard. My eyes were open, heart thudding hard in my chest. The sound wasn't near the tent yet. It was coming from near the barn. The steps would stop for long stretches, then start again. I reached for the hunting knife I kept next to my sleeping bag. I didn't move otherwise. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't breathe loud. I just waited. The footsteps came closer, but never directly toward the tent. They circled the barn, then back around the clearing. I started to think maybe it was an animal, a deer maybe, but then it stopped. For maybe 10 minutes, nothing. Then I heard the faint sound of something tapping metal. Once, then again, like someone tapping a knife or a pipe against something. A dull ring, then silence. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up with sunlight pouring through the tent. It was around 7. The fire was out completely. Everything was damp from dew. My boots were cold and stiff. I got out and looked around. Nothing was moved. No tracks. But over by the barn door, I saw something that wasn't there the day before. A thin branch was stuck in the ground upright, like someone had jabbed it into the dirt. At the top, tied with string, was a dirty piece of cloth. It looked like an old sock, torn open and knotted up. I walked closer and saw it had something inside. I didn't open it. I didn't touch it. I just backed away and looked at the edge of the tree line. Something was off. Way off. I packed up quickly, skipping breakfast. I stuffed my tent into the truck bed without even folding it right. I left the camp chair. Didn't care. I just wanted to be gone. But the truck wouldn't start. I turned the key and nothing happened. Not even a click. I checked the battery cables, they were tight. I tried again. Nothing. I've worked with engines my whole life. The battery wasn't dead. Something was wrong electrically, but it didn't make sense. Everything had worked the night before. The only option I had was to walk. There was no cell signal, and the nearest town had to be at least 10 miles back. I took my knife, a bottle of water, and started walking fast down the gravel path. I kept hearing twigs snap behind me. Every time I stopped, the noise stopped. I'd turn around and there'd be nothing there. I wasn't being paranoid. I knew what I heard. I made it back to the main road after almost 2 hours of walking. A passing pickup finally stopped for me. An old man, probably in his 70s. I didn't tell him everything. Just said my truck wouldn't start and I needed a ride into town. He took me to a gas station near the highway. I used their phone to call a tow truck and paid in cash. The guy who drove out to get my truck was friendly at first, but when I told him where it was, he got quiet. He said, "That place by the old Jenkins barn?" I nodded. He didn't say much after that, just shrugged and drove. When we got back to the truck, he didn't get out right away. He looked around the clearing for a long time before saying, "You camp here last night?" I just said yeah. He didn't ask anything else. He hooked the truck up and told me to ride with him. On the drive back, he finally said, "That land's been empty since '89. Nobody's supposed to go back there. Not since that fire." I asked what fire. He just said some folks went missing out there. He said nobody local camps near that place. He said most people leave it alone. He dropped my truck at a mechanic in town, and I got a motel room for the night. When I picked up the truck the next day, the mechanic told me the ignition coil was fried, and he couldn't explain why. Said it looked like it had been yanked loose and melted from heat, but there were no burn marks, no wires singed, just broken, as if someone had gotten under the hood and messed with it but didn't leave a trace. I never went back for my chair. I don't camp alone anymore, not since then. I still don't know who was walking around that night. I don't know what that sock bundle was supposed to mean, but I trust my instincts, and everything in me told me to leave. I didn't feel like I was in danger from an animal. I felt like I was being toyed with, watched, kept in that clearing on purpose. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can hear those slow, careful footsteps circling the barn. I should have never stopped there. I was 33 the summer I decided to camp alone in the countryside for a weekend. It was 2019, late August, and I had taken time off from work. I was living in Bristol back then, working a dull job in IT, the kind that slowly melts your brain with spreadsheets and blinking screens. I needed a break, something quiet, something real. I'd been looking up places to camp that weren't too far, somewhere that didn't attract too many tourists or families. I didn't want crowded campgrounds. I just wanted open space and silence. After searching for a while, I found a place in South Gloucestershire, somewhere between Watton-under-Edge and Dursley. It wasn't listed on any main camping websites, but someone on a forum mentioned it. Just an open bit of private farmland the owner allowed people to use if they kept to themselves and didn't leave rubbish behind. No facilities, no hookups, just countryside and thick hedgerows for miles. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed light but enough. One-man tent, sleeping bag, foldable chair, small gas stove, a couple of dehydrated meals, water, my pocket knife, and a small axe. I also had a basic first aid kit, a power bank for my phone, and a good headlamp. I liked doing things the old-fashioned way, but I wasn't stupid. I left on a Friday afternoon, took the M5 and then cut into the smaller country lanes until I reached the edge of the land. I had arranged ahead of time with the landowner by email, just paid him through bank transfer. He gave me a simple map, said I could go past the second gate and find a spot near the old tree line, away from the cows and sheep. I parked near the first fence and walked the rest of the way. The ground was uneven, the grass dry and tall. I could hear the soft hum of flies and the sharp chirp of crickets. Every now and then a wood pigeon cooed somewhere deeper in the trees. The sky was clear, the air smelled like cut grass and cow dung, and it all felt calm. I found a perfect little flat space tucked close to the trees but not too deep. The sun was still up when I pitched my tent, and I took my time making sure everything was tight and solid. I gathered some dry twigs and brushwood, dug a little fire pit away from the tent, and made a small fire just before the sun started dipping below the hills. The light turned soft, golden, and long shadows stretched from the trees behind me. It was peaceful, too peaceful. I sat in my chair, eating one of those chicken and rice packs with hot water. I listened to the countryside settle into its nighttime rhythm. A breeze moved through the leaves, and there were no cars, no phones ringing, no emails, just the crackle of fire and the creaking of branches above. But around 9, maybe a little later, I started to feel watched. Not scared, just a little off. I brushed it off. That happens when you camp alone, especially near woods. Your senses go into overdrive. I threw more sticks into the fire and turned on my headlamp. Around 10, I doused the fire and climbed into the tent. The ground was bumpy, and I couldn't sleep well. I tossed and turned. My ears picked up every noise. Something heavy moved in the bushes behind the tent once, and I sat up completely still, holding the little axe in my hand for nearly an hour before I convinced myself it was a badger or maybe a deer. Eventually, I fell asleep. I woke up just past 3. No idea why. I didn't need the toilet. I wasn't cold. I just woke up like something had pulled me out of sleep. The inside of the tent was silent. I turned on the headlamp, just low brightness. My ears were ringing slightly, one of those weird nighttime silences where even the wind stops. Then I heard something again. Steps. Not animal steps. Not rustling. Not snuffling in the grass. Just heavy footsteps. In the distance, but not far. Deliberate. Crunching through the grass. They weren't coming closer, just sort of pacing. I killed the light, sat there in the dark with the axe again. I waited. The steps kept going slow, then they stopped. Nothing for maybe 5 minutes. Then they started again, this time more to the right. Still not close, but not far enough for me to relax. I didn't sleep after that. Not even a little. I stayed frozen in place for hours, the axe sweating in my hand, my back stiff. The footsteps never came closer, but they never left either. By dawn, they were gone. I unzipped the tent slowly. The light outside was pale, misty, grass wet from dew. I didn't see anything unusual, no tracks that stood out, though I wasn't exactly a train tracker. The spot still looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. Something had changed in my mind. The peaceful silence was gone. Now everything felt like it was hiding something. I stayed close to the tent that day. I didn't go hiking like I planned. I stayed near the trees, kept the axe with me at all times. Every hour or so, I'd get up and do a small walk around the area to see if I noticed anyone else nearby. I didn't. No tents, no people, no signs of anything human. I kept telling myself maybe it was a poacher or a farmhand checking on animals. But that didn't explain the pacing, or the way it kept stopping and moving again. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't cook anything hot. I sat in silence with everything packed and ready. I left the tent up just in case I was imagining things. But I didn't plan to sleep. Around 1 in the morning, I heard the footsteps again. No mistaking them. Same sound, same weight, but this time closer. I turned off the headlamp and crouched behind a thick patch of grass near a tree. I waited with my breath held, axe in hand. I could see the tent clearly from my position, and under the moonlight, something moved. Not directly toward it, just near it. I couldn't see clearly, but I saw a shape. Upright, human, not big, not small, just average. The way they moved was slow, not sneaking, just walking like they belonged there. They walked a slow circle around the tent. Once, then again. Then they stopped, stood completely still for minutes, facing the tent. They didn't go inside, didn't touch it. Then they walked off back into the trees. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. At first light, I grabbed everything. Tent, gear, bag, and hiked straight back to the car. I didn't eat, didn't stop for water. I just left. I drove until I hit the main road and didn't look back. I didn't report it. I didn't tell the landowner. What would I even say? I didn't camp alone again after that. A month later, I looked up the area again online out of curiosity. I wasn't trying to spook myself, just looking. Someone on a forum had posted about their stay there the year before. They'd also heard footsteps at night. Their car was keyed the next morning. Nothing else. No attacks. No arrests. No missing people. Just small things like that. But enough of them. Too many to ignore. Quiet warnings, I guess. The countryside is beautiful. It's wide and open and calm. But it's also empty in the worst way. Out there, no one hears you yell. No one checks on your tent. You think you're alone, but maybe you're not. And whoever's out there, if someone's out there, they know how far they are from the nearest person who can help you. They know you're alone. And that's the part that sticks with me. It wasn't that something tried to hurt me. It was that it didn't. It just watched. I don't know why I decided to go back out camping that summer. I was 31, living alone in a rented flat just outside Norwich, and for the past few years, I'd been trying to get away from the noise of town life whenever I could. That year, work had been eating me alive. I was working in industrial painting, sometimes doing 14-hour shifts inside hot, echoing steel tanks. The last job I did before this trip was in a power station, spraying a ceiling for 3 straight days in July heat. I was exhausted. My back ached all the time. My hands were cracked from the solvent, and my sleep was broken every night. I thought a few days in the countryside might help. I didn't want to go anywhere popular or full of tourists. I didn't want lakes or caravan parks or areas where kids would be riding bikes around all day. I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere nobody really went. I remembered this old quarry I had seen once years ago with an ex-girlfriend. We had driven past it by accident in 2009, and I remembered there was a narrow path that led off a dirt road into a hollow surrounded by trees. It was somewhere between Thetford and Brandon, past a rundown farm and a cluster of pine woods. I spent a bit of time on satellite maps until I found it again. The plan was simple. I'd take my tent, a gas burner, a small cooler, and stay there for 3 nights. I packed light, just canned food, basic gear, a hunting knife I never used, and some clothes. I set off mid-morning and parked the car just off a side road hidden between hedges. It didn't look like anyone had driven down that way in months. Grass had grown up in the middle of the track, and the ditches on either side were full of brambles. It took me about 10 minutes to get my gear from the car to the quarry, moving slowly and quietly under the weight of the pack. The quarry wasn't deep, but it was wide and overgrown. Bushes and small trees had started growing out of the rock face. There was a soft smell of moss and warm stone. I found a flat, shaded spot tucked beneath an outcrop that would keep the sun off my tent in the mornings. I pitched it there, then sat on a log for a long time just listening to the wind move through the trees above me. There wasn't a single man-made sound, no cars, no planes, no dogs barking. Just wind and insects. That first night went fine. I cooked some beans, had a couple of beers, and lay in my sleeping bag with the flap open, watching the stars through the mesh. I heard a fox bark somewhere far off, but nothing else. No footsteps, no voices, nothing that made me feel nervous. I felt like I'd made a good call coming out here. The second day was slow. I read for a bit, explored the edge of the quarry, found a path that led to some collapsed wooden fencing and what looked like the remains of an old shed, probably left from when they used to extract gravel here. There were big rusted metal sheets half buried in the grass, covered in lichen. I didn't go far, just enough to stretch my legs. The silence continued, not eerie, just still. Too still, maybe. I remember thinking, as the sun dropped behind the trees that second evening, that I hadn't seen a single person in 2 days. Not even a dog walker in the distance. That was strange for Norfolk, even in remote spots. The second night I went to sleep a little earlier, worn out from the heat. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. Not because of a sound, but because of the absence of one. The night had been full of chirping insects and distant animal calls. Now it was completely dead. No wind.
No bugs, no owls.
Just silent air pressing down on the tent. I stayed still for a long time, just breathing. I thought maybe a larger animal had come into the area, something that spooked the smaller ones. I reached slowly for the torch beside me and turned it on. The beam lit up the inside of the tent, and for a few seconds I just listened. Nothing. But then I felt it, a vibration. Not through the ground, through the air, like someone was walking nearby, softly, and the steps were barely too quiet to hear, but the motion carried in the stillness. It was almost like you feel in your chest when someone walks across a wooden floor above you. I sat up and unzipped the inner layer, then the flap, and slowly leaned out. The trees were just black shapes now, silhouettes against a navy sky. I aimed the torch out and swept it around slowly. Nothing. I even stepped out barefoot just to be sure. I checked around the tent. Still nothing. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just trying to shake the unease off me. After a while, the wind picked up again. The insects started back up. I got back in and zipped up, but I didn't sleep well after that. I kept waking up, staring at the tent walls, convinced I could hear something just outside. Every time I looked, there was nothing. The third day, I felt off, tired, on edge. I moved slowly, checked around the camp constantly, even though I knew nobody was out here. Still, I couldn't get that feeling out of my chest, that someone had been near me that night, watching, waiting for something. I wanted to go home, but I told myself I was overreacting. I had one night left, just one. That evening, I stayed up later. I kept the fire going for as long as I could, sipping on a warm beer, trying to keep my nerves in check. Around midnight, the fire was low, and I had started nodding off sitting up. I decided to crawl back into the tent and sleep in my clothes, just in case. I left the torch by my head, unzipped the sleeping bag so I could move quickly if needed. I must have been asleep less than an hour when something woke me. This time it was clear. A sound. Slow movement outside the tent. Not animals. Not wind. It was the sound of fabric brushing against something. Then a footstep. Slow. Deliberate. Not pacing, not running. just slow crunches of someone walking in grass and dry leaves. I sat up, heart hammering. I didn't turn on the torch. I listened. The footsteps circled halfway around the tent. Then they stopped. No sound after that. No walking away. Just stopped. That silence felt worse than the steps. I reached for the knife I had packed and held it tight in my right hand. My other hand hovered over the torch switch, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to show I was awake. Minutes passed. I don't know how many. I just sat frozen, waiting for the sound to come back. Eventually, I must have passed out again. The next thing I remember was the light of dawn coming through the tent wall. I didn't bother checking for tracks. I didn't even eat. I packed everything in 10 minutes, barely even tying it down properly. I hiked out of that quarry, pack bouncing against my back, sweat pouring down my neck even though it was still cool. When I reached the car, I dropped everything in the back and drove without looking in the mirror. It's been over a decade since that trip, and I've never camped alone again. Not once. I told myself for years that it was probably just some old local, someone living rough or passing through. Maybe they were curious about the tent. Maybe they thought I was trespassing. But it didn't feel like that. It didn't feel like someone who stumbled into the quarry by accident. The steps were too slow, too careful, like they knew I was there and didn't want to scare me. Or maybe they did. I still think about how quiet it got just before it happened. I still think about how long they stood there, just outside, not moving, not walking away, just watching. Whatever it was, it knew I was alone, and I'm certain it wasn't the first time they'd done it. It was the summer of 2012, and I was 24. I'd been laid off from my job 2 months earlier and hadn't really told anyone. I just kept going through the motions, spending most days sleeping and most nights walking or driving around aimlessly. I was still living in Mansfield, a quiet, small town in Nottinghamshire. Nothing ever really happened there. Same roads, same faces, same tired fields stretching out around the edge of town. There was this old graveyard on the east side, past the woods, up a sloping dirt path that hardly anyone used anymore. It was fenced off years ago, but the gate rusted open and stayed that way. One evening, I drove out that way. I'd been planning to do a kind of solo camping night for a while, just to get away from everything. I didn't want to go into the forest because there were too many families and hikers this time of year, and I didn't want to risk being asked questions. I remembered that graveyard from when I was a teenager. It had been abandoned for decades. Most of the stones had sunk, the names had faded, and there were trees growing between the rows now. It wasn't exactly peaceful, but it was quiet, and that's what I wanted. I packed light, just a tarp, sleeping bag, some snacks, water, a flashlight, a portable stove, and my old hunting knife that I hadn't used in years. I didn't bother with a tent. I parked my car about a mile down the main road and walked the rest of the way in, cutting across fields and up through the tree line. The sun was low and orange by the time I reached the graveyard. The place looked smaller than I remembered. The fence had collapsed in some areas, and the ground was uneven with tangled roots and brittle weeds. The gravestones were all crooked, some split in half, others overtaken by ivy. I walked around for a while, checking the place out. There was a big yew tree near the middle, and I decided to make my camp there. It was dry underneath, and the branches covered most of the area like a roof. I spread my tarp and rolled out my sleeping bag, propping my backpack against the trunk. Once it got dark, I cooked some noodles, drank water straight from the bottle, and sat quietly with the flashlight off, letting my eyes adjust. The moon was bright enough to see by, and everything had this pale, washed-out look. I was fine at first. It was just like any other night outside. Crickets, distant barking, the occasional breeze. It was peaceful. But around midnight, I started noticing something strange. The woods around the graveyard weren't silent, but they were still, like the normal night sounds had shifted. There were no rustles, no small animal sounds anymore. No owls either. It wasn't a loud silence. It was tight, like the kind of silence you get in a hallway when you think someone's walking behind you but nothing's there. The hairs on my arms started to rise. I kept still and listened, telling myself it was just my brain playing tricks. Then I heard something I couldn't explain. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even close. It sounded like something dry being dragged slowly across the ground. Not grass, not leaves. Something more like cloth or maybe rope. It was coming from beyond the tree line, past the gravestones. I sat up slowly and reached for the knife. I didn't turn on the flashlight yet. I kept still and kept listening. I told myself it might be an animal, maybe a fox or a deer caught in something. But the sound kept going, dragging slow and steady, like someone pulling a sack behind them across gravel. I finally turned on the light and swept it around. Nothing, but I didn't feel alone anymore. I stood up and slowly walked toward where the sound had come from, careful with every step. My light caught the edge of a gravestone with deep cracks, and something looked off near the base. It was dark, but I could see that the grass had been flattened in a strange pattern, like something had been sitting or laying there. The weeds were crushed, and there were marks in the dirt, drag marks. I crouched and looked closer. The marks were fresh. Whatever it was, it had moved recently. My stomach started to knot up. I looked around and shone my light toward the other side of the graveyard. That's when I saw it. There was a figure, far off, maybe 20 or 30 meters away. It was standing completely still between two leaning stones. I could just make out the shape, tall, bony, with long arms hanging low. I froze. I didn't breathe. I just kept the light on it. It didn't move. I started stepping backward, slowly, keeping the beams centered. I wasn't sure if it was even a person. The way it stood was unnatural, off balance, but it didn't fall. My flashlight started flickering. I hit the side of it hard. When it came back on, the figure was gone. I turned back toward the yew tree and started moving fast, tripping over roots and stones. I gathered my things without packing, just stuffing them into the bag as fast as I could. I slung it over my shoulder, knife still in hand, and started down the slope, using the flashlight as best I could. I didn't look back. Halfway down the hill, I lost my footing on the wet grass and fell, slamming hard on my side. My flashlight flew out of my hand and rolled somewhere in the brush. I scrambled, but I couldn't find it. I pulled out my phone for light, but the battery had drained to 2%. It died while I was fumbling with the screen. So now I was stuck in near darkness, with only the faint moonlight through the trees to see. I didn't stop. I kept moving. Then I heard the dragging again. This time it was closer. I didn't run because the terrain would have made me fall again. I just walked fast, one foot in front of the other, trying not to make noise. I passed through the old fence, didn't care about the metal tearing my jacket. I reached the tree line and kept going. Then I smelled something. It was sharp, metallic, like rust and earth, and something else underneath, sour, old, like rotting meat. I stopped and turned, and that was the only time I looked back. At the top of the hill, at the edge of the graveyard, I saw it again. Not standing this time, crouching. Still tall, still long. Just hunched low like it was watching. I didn't wait anymore. I forced my way through the underbrush and down the slope, following the dirt path until I saw the road. My legs were cramping, my lungs were tight, but I didn't stop until I got to the car. I locked the doors and sat there for a long time before driving. I didn't turn the engine on right away. I didn't even breathe right. I just sat there with my hands on the wheel, soaked in sweat, shaking. When I finally drove off, I didn't look in the mirrors. I didn't even look at the road much. I just kept my foot on the gas. I never told anyone. I didn't go to the police because there was nothing to report. No laws broken, no crime, just something strange, something I didn't understand. I've looked into it since, people seeing things in old graveyards. Most of it is ghost stories and folklore, nothing that really fits. I went back once, months later, in the daylight. I took a friend with me that time. I didn't tell him why I wanted to go. The place looked normal, overgrown, quiet, broken stones and weeds. But there were fresh marks again. New drag patterns in the dirt, some barely days old. We didn't stay long. I still don't know what I saw. I know it wasn't a ghost. It was real. I saw it. It stood on 2 feet. It moved. It watched. It dragged something. Or maybe it was the thing being dragged. I don't know. But I never camped again after that. Not alone. Not anywhere near a graveyard. Something about that place wasn't right, and whatever I saw, it's still there. And I don't think it wants to be seen again. It was November 2016, and I was 34 years old when I decided to take a solo hunting trip deep into the forests near Chippewa National Forest in northern Minnesota. I've been planning it for a while. I used to go hunting with my dad when I was a kid, but after he passed, I kind of let the tradition slide. That year, I had some time off work and felt the urge to get out there again. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. I packed everything in my old Toyota Tacoma the night before and left early in the morning. I had my rifle, tent, cooking gear, sleeping bag, 2 coolers packed with food, and just enough supplies to last 4 days. My phone barely had reception out there anyway, but I brought a power bank just in case. The plan was simple. Park at the edge of a logging road I'd scouted on satellite maps, hike in about 3 miles, and set up camp near a small, shallow lake. I'd seen plenty of deer signs in that area last time I went with a buddy years ago. The hike in wasn't too bad. Cold, dry air filled my lungs and made everything feel sharper. The leaves were mostly gone by then, and the forest had this raw, quiet feel to it. No bugs, no people, no traffic sounds. Just birds, distant rustling, and the creaking of trees in the wind. I reached the lake around midday, found a nice flat spot under a cluster of pines, and set up my tent there. I built a small fire ring, gathered wood, and had the whole place ready to go by late afternoon. That first night went smooth. I cooked some sausages on the fire, drank a couple cans of beer, and watched the stars for a while before crawling into my sleeping bag. It was cold, but I had layered up, slept well. The second day, I woke up at dawn, had some instant coffee, and set out east from camp with my rifle. I tracked some old deer trails and eventually settled near a ridge with a good view down into a narrow valley. I waited there for a few hours, scanning the trees and listening. Nothing moved. I didn't mind. Just being out there again felt good. Around noon, I headed back to camp for a quick lunch and then went back out until sundown. Still no deer. That night, something felt a bit off. I'm not talking about some supernatural gut feeling or anything like that. Just small things. I heard what sounded like a branch snap not far from camp while I was eating. I paused, listened, but didn't hear anything else. I figured it could have been a raccoon or something. I kept the fire going a little longer that night, and before I went to sleep, I walked around the immediate area to make sure there weren't any fresh tracks from bears or wolves. There weren't. I didn't sleep as well that night. I kept waking up. Around 2 or 3 a.m., I thought I heard something brushing lightly against the outside of my tent. Just once, very faint, like cloth against nylon. I stayed still, heart beating fast, listening in the dark for a long time. No footsteps, no breathing, no follow-up sounds. Eventually, I dozed off again. Next morning, I stepped out and checked around the tent. No prints. The ground was hard, mostly pine needles and dry leaves. But the weird part was that one of the logs I had stacked near the fire ring was moved. Not rolled away, just tilted oddly, like someone kicked it half-heartedly. I stared at it for a while, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but it left me on edge. I headed out again that morning but stayed closer to camp. I couldn't focus, kept thinking about the noise from the night before. Midday, I returned to camp, had some jerky and peanuts, and decided to try hunting in a different direction. West, toward an old trail that had clearly been in use for years. Everything was quiet, and I was the only one out there as far as I knew. Around 3 p.m., I started heading back. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were fresh boot prints not far from my camp. They weren't mine. I always walked with a slight outward angle on my left foot because of an old ankle injury, and these didn't have that. They were straighter, smaller than my size 12s. They came from the treeline and circled my tent once, just once, then led back the way they came. I stood there for a long time, just staring at those tracks. I hadn't seen another soul out here. No vehicles at the trailhead. No distant gunshots from other hunters. No one. I scanned the trees. Nothing. I followed the prints for a bit, but they faded off into thicker brush about 200 yards out. I didn't want to go too far. I went back to camp, stirred the fire back to life, and kept my rifle closer than usual. I didn't cook anything that night, just sat there, waiting for dark, watching the treeline. I felt exposed, like I wasn't alone anymore. When it got dark, I decided not to sleep in the tent. I rolled up my sleeping bag and carried it about 50 yards into the brush to a small depression behind some fallen logs. From there, I had a partial view of the tent and fire pit. I tucked myself in, kept my rifle by my side, and tried to stay quiet. I didn't sleep. Sometime deep in the night, I saw a faint light, like a flashlight but not pointed directly at me. It was moving slowly, just beyond the edge of the lake. It bobbed along the trees, weaving in and out of sight. Then it stopped. I squinted, trying to see better, but it didn't move again for a long time, maybe 20 minutes. I couldn't tell if it was facing the camp or scanning the woods. I didn't move. I didn't breathe loud. Eventually, it just went out. I stayed there until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. My body was stiff, cold, but I didn't care. As soon as I felt it was safe, I packed up everything in a rush. No breakfast, no breakdown of camp. I tossed things into my pack, rolled up the tent without folding it properly, and started hiking back out. About halfway to the truck, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. A small pile of stones. 5 of them, stacked carefully in a perfect little tower right in the middle of the trail. It wasn't there 2 days ago. Not natural, and not the kind of thing kids build. It looked intentional, placed there like a sign or a message. I stepped around it and kept moving. The rest of the hike felt like miles longer than it really was. Every few hundred feet, I kept looking over my shoulder. When I got back to the truck, it was untouched. I threw my gear in the back, slammed the tailgate shut, and drove the hell out of there. I didn't stop until I hit the nearest town with a gas station. I sat there for 20 minutes just catching my breath. I didn't call anyone or tell anyone at first. What would I say? That someone had been watching me? That there were boot prints and lights and stacked rocks? But something had been out there. I don't know who or why, but I do know this: I wasn't alone. Someone was watching my camp, moving near it when I slept, walking up to my tent. They didn't steal anything, didn't talk, didn't leave notes or signs, just watched. That's what stuck with me the most. The silence. I haven't been back out hunting since. Not alone, anyway. It was the summer of 2014. I had just turned 27, and for the first time in years, I had a full 2 weeks off work.
No emails. No deadlines.
No calls. I needed the break more than I realized. I'd been working in a warehouse in Dayton, Ohio, where the days were long, the concrete was hot, and the noise never stopped. That kind of job wears you down without you even knowing it. I didn't want to go to a beach or stay in a hotel or do anything that involved cities or people. I just wanted space, trees, dirt, quiet. I didn't have much money, so I packed up my old gray Toyota Tacoma with a basic camping setup. A tent, a small cooler, a tarp, and a folding chair. I grabbed a couple maps, a cheap compass, a flashlight, and a hatchet that had belonged to my uncle. I left my phone off.
No GPS.
I wanted to feel like I was away from everything. I drove west through Indiana and into Illinois. Just kept going until I hit the southern part of Missouri, near Mark Twain National Forest. I didn't have a solid plan, just to find a patch of land far enough from any trailheads or campsites. I didn't want to see another person for at least a few days. I ended up about 50 miles from the nearest town, a place called Bixby. Dirt roads turned into rough gravel, and then into nothing but tire tracks running through the trees. I followed them until they stopped. It was perfect. Dense trees all around, hills rolling off in every direction. No signs.
No fences.
No sounds except wind and bugs. I hiked about a mile in with my gear and set up camp near a dry creek bed. The ground was flat, and the forest had a good canopy overhead. There was a pile of smooth stones near the creek that looked like it had been stacked by water over the years. I cleared a spot for a fire pit, set up my tent, and hung the tarp between two trees. I didn't even bother looking at the time. Felt good not to care. The first 2 days were everything I needed. The air smelled clean. The forest felt empty in the best way. I cooked beans and sausage in a little pot, boiled water from the creek, and just sat around listening to birds and wind. I didn't even read. I just listened. I'd forgotten how loud the forest could be at night. Owls, bugs, rustling. But nothing ever felt wrong. Just alive. It changed on the third night. It was around midnight. I'd gone to bed early after a long walk. I'd followed the creek upstream for about 3 miles that afternoon, climbed a steep ridge, and came back sore and scratched up. I was dead tired, and it took no time to pass out. But something woke me. I didn't know what it was at first. I laid there, staring up at the roof of the tent, heart beating too fast for how quiet everything was. The crickets had stopped. It wasn't silent, but it was close. No frogs, no breeze, no leaves moving. Just dead still. I thought maybe it was a deer. Sometimes they come close, curious about the smell of food. But then I heard the footsteps. Not heavy, but not light either. 2 feet. Slow. I know the difference between 4-legged and 2-legged movement. This was a person, or something walking like one. It circled the tent once. The sound was just far enough that I couldn't see a shadow on the walls. I sat up and grabbed the hatchet. I didn't move, didn't breathe too loud. Just listened. The steps came again. They stopped right behind the tent. I held the hatchet tighter. Then it went quiet. For maybe 30 minutes, nothing.
No sounds.
No more steps. I waited, staring at the back wall of the tent until my eyes burned. Then, just when I started to lower the hatchet, I heard a deep breathing. Low, slow, but strong. Like someone was crouched down right outside the tent wall. Not moving, just breathing through their nose. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. By morning, I stepped out of the tent slowly, checking every direction. Nothing was there. No tracks in the dirt. No broken twigs. Just the forest again. But it didn't feel peaceful anymore. I packed up most of my gear and moved camp a few hundred yards south, closer to the ridge. I told myself maybe it was some hiker who got lost or was curious, but I didn't believe that. That day was tense. I didn't go far. I collected firewood and stayed close. I kept hearing small snaps in the woods, far off but regular, like someone walking through the brush and pausing. I started to feel watched. That night, I didn't build a fire. I stayed in the tent, listening again. Nothing for hours. Then, close to 2 a.m., I heard it again. The breathing, right outside the back of the tent. This time it was louder, like it was leaning into the fabric. I didn't move. My body was locked in place, every hair on my arms standing up. The breathing stopped suddenly. Then I heard footsteps again, this time slow and dragging. Not like a limp, more like it wasn't in a rush. It circled the tent again. When it got to the front, I saw the shadow. It was tall. The outline was wrong. Too thin in the arms, too long in the neck, shoulders that hunched forward like it didn't belong upright. But it stood there, unmoving, for at least 5 minutes. Couldn't breathe. My hand clenched the hatchet so tight it hurt. Then it walked off, just calmly walked into the woods and disappeared. I didn't sleep. By the 4th day, I knew I had to leave. I packed up at first light and started hiking back to the truck. But the woods had changed. I got turned around within 20 minutes. The hills looked the same. The trees felt tighter, closer. I started sweating even though the air was cool. I followed the dry creek bed back, trying to use landmarks, the smooth stone pile, a split tree, a burned stump. But nothing looked familiar. I walked for hours. The forest seemed endless. Every now and then, I'd stop and listen. I kept hearing snapping sticks behind me, just out of sight. At one point, I stopped to drink water and saw something in the trees across from me, maybe 50 feet away, just standing there. It looked like a man, but wrong. Pale, thin, not wearing anything that I could see. Its limbs were too long. His head turned slightly, just enough for me to know it saw me. I didn't run. I just backed away and kept walking. I never saw it move. It just watched. By late afternoon, I finally found a familiar marker, the pile of rocks near the creek. I nearly collapsed from relief. I followed it downstream and finally saw the clearing where my truck was parked. I didn't stop. I didn't rest. I threw my gear in the back without even folding it and drove. I didn't feel safe until I hit the pavement near Bixby. And even then, I kept looking in the rearview mirror. I never reported anything. Who would I even call? It wasn't a crime, and I don't know what it was. I don't believe in ghosts or fairy tales or monsters, but I know what I saw. I know how it made me feel. I still camp, but never in that part of Missouri again. I stick to places with people, with signs, with cell service. I don't go too deep anymore. I don't turn off my phone. Sometimes, late at night, if I'm near the woods, I'll hear a branch snap. And every time I do, I stop and listen. I wait for the breathing. I wait for the footsteps. But nothing ever comes close again. Not yet. I was 34 when I decided to go camping alone for the first time. It wasn't because I had no one to go with. I had friends. I had people around. But there was something in me that wanted to be away from everyone for a while. That year, in 2018, I'd gone through a hard breakup, quit my job at a warehouse in Bedford, and had been spending most of my time indoors since April. By late September, I'd had enough of walls and screens. I wanted trees, wind, and silence that didn't hum from a machine. I didn't want a popular campsite with toilets and barbecues. I wanted to wild camp. I'd read about Epping Forest, just northeast of London, and found a few mentions of less-used trails and remote clearings where people occasionally pitched up for a night or two. It sounded like exactly what I needed. Nothing polished or regulated, just woods, dirt, and a break from everything. I packed light: tent, sleeping bag, headlamp, knife, a change of clothes, dried food, a few liters of water, and a small camping stove. I left my phone in airplane mode to save battery. I took the train to Loughton, then walked. It was colder than I expected. The trees were thick and tall, and the paths started fading the deeper I went. After about 3 hours, I left the marked trail and followed a faint footpath that twisted between low branches and tall grass. I crossed a small stream and climbed a muddy bank. On the other side was a clearing that looked like it hadn't seen people in a while. No bottles, no fire pits, no flattened grass. Just soft earth and fallen leaves. I liked that. It felt untouched. I set up camp near a rotting log. By the time I'd boiled water for a meal, it was getting dark. Not gradual dusk either. Forest dark comes fast. One moment you can see the shapes of trees. The next, it's just black trunks and silhouettes. I climbed into my sleeping bag early, just after 8, and zipped the tent. I wasn't tired, but I didn't have anything else to do. The wind picked up around 10. It made that sound. Leaves and branches shifting, trees creaking. I was used to city sounds, so it took some effort to stay calm. Every little snap outside sounded too close. But I told myself it was just animals or the forest settling. That worked. For a while. At around 1 in the morning, I woke up. I don't know what exactly stirred me. Maybe the cold or a noise, but my eyes opened, and I was instantly alert. The wind had died down. It was too quiet. I couldn't hear anything at all. No rustling, no ous, no brise. That stillness didn't feel natural. I lay there, frozen, eyes open inside the tent. I didn't want to reach for my torch because something in me didn't want to draw attention. My breathing slowed as I listened. At first, I thought I was just imagining things. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, crunching on leaves. Not a deer or a fox. Not that weight. This was careful. Too careful. They stopped. I stayed still, barely breathing. I couldn't see anything through the tent walls, but I felt something, or someone, standing outside. 10, maybe 15 seconds passed. Then I heard it again. A faint rustle, like a jacket brushing against a branch. Then more footsteps, this time not walking away, but circling, around my tent, clockwise. It wasn't fast. It wasn't aggressive, but it was deliberate. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Couldn't. The footsteps stopped behind me. I lay there for what felt like forever. Then I heard it. A sharp, dragging breath, like someone inhaling slowly through their nose. Long, deep, just once. Then nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed locked in position, heart pounding so hard I felt it in my ears. Eventually, dawn began to filter through the fabric of the tent. The gray light was enough for me to finally move. I unzipped the tent, hands shaking, and stepped outside. Nothing. No one. But the ground outside had marks, fresh ones. Footprints in the soft dirt. They weren't boot prints either. They were trainers, not mine. I checked around the clearing, following them a few feet before they disappeared into the undergrowth. I packed up fast. I didn't eat. I didn't stop. I just shoved everything into my bag and headed in the direction I thought was the way out. Problem was, I didn't remember exactly how I came in. After an hour of walking and turning around multiple times, I found the stream again and followed it west, hoping it would intersect with a trail. Eventually, it did. I walked until I saw people again, joggers, dog walkers, normal life. I didn't speak to anyone. I just headed straight for the train station, took the next train to London, then home. I didn't tell anyone what happened for a while. When I did, they all gave the same sort of laugh or shrug, saying it was probably some other wild camper or some drunk taking a shortcut. But that doesn't make sense. I'd gone far off trail. There were no bottles, no fire pits, no signs of others. Whoever it was, they didn't stumble on me by accident. They were quiet. They knew where I was, and they waited until the middle of the night to approach. That's what stayed with me the most. The patience. Weeks later, I looked up reports and forums about Epping Forest. I found some talk about odd encounters. People seeing shapes in the woods, hearing breathing, hearing someone walking around their tents late at night. Some of it sounded exaggerated, But not all of it. I never went back to that forest. I still camp sometimes, but never alone, and never without a backup phone and GPS. Because I know what I felt out there, and I know what I heard. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't someone passing through. It was a man, a quiet one, slow, careful, watching, and I'll never forget the sound of him breathing just outside my tent. That one long breath, like he was smelling the air, like he was trying to remember me,